Before we dive into one of aviation's greatest unsolved mysteries, if you're enjoying this content, please consider using your hype points on this video. It truly helps the channel more than you could possibly know. If you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review makes an incredible difference for us. We'd also love to hear from you in the comments. Let us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're tuning in from, but only if you want to share. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is listening from around the globe. And if you're enjoying these deep dives into history's darkest corners, please consider subscribing. It means everything to us. Now, let's begin. The static crackles through the radio receiver. A woman's voice, strained but steady, cuts through the interference one final time. Then, nothing. Just the endless hiss of dead air stretching across thousands of miles of empty ocean. July 2nd, 1937. Somewhere over the Pacific Ocean, a Lockheed Electra carrying two souls simply vanishes from existence. No distress call, no wreckage, no bodies. One moment, Amelia Earhart is transmitting her position. The next, she's gone, swallowed by the largest ocean on Earth as if she'd never existed at all. For more than 80 years, the world has asked the same question. What really happened to Amelia Earhart? The official story seems simple enough. A pioneering aviator pushed too far, ran out of fuel, and plunged into the Pacific. Case closed. A tragic accident, nothing more. The United States Navy searched over 250,000 square miles of ocean and found nothing. Eventually they gave up. The world moved on. But did they move on too quickly? What if Amelia Earhart didn't simply crash into the ocean? What if her disappearance wasn't an accident at all, but something far more deliberate being orchestrated, concealed, buried beneath layers of official silence and geopolitical secrecy? Tonight we're going to examine the evidence, the theories and the questions that refuse to die. We're going to explore the possibility that one of history's most famous disappearances might actually be one of history's most successful cover-ups. This is the story of the last flight of Amelia Earhart, and nothing about it is as simple as you've been told. Chapter 1. The woman who defied the sky. To understand why Amelia Earhart's disappearance became the stuff of legend, you first need to understand who she was and what she represented in an era when women were expected to stay grounded in every sense of the word. Amelia Mary Earhart was born on July 24th, 1897, in Atchison, Kansas. From childhood, she was different. While other girls played with dolls, young Amelia collected newspaper clippings about successful women in male-dominated fields. She kept a scrapbook of female film directors, lawyers, engineers, and advertisers. Even then, she was preparing herself for a life that would defy convention. Her first flight came in 1920 at a California airfield. The pilot took her up for 10 minutes, and by the time they landed, Amelia's fate was sealed. She later wrote that as soon as they left the ground, she knew she had to fly. Within days, she was taking lessons. Within a year, she'd bought her first plane, a bright yellow Kinner Airster she nicknamed the Canary. But it was 1932 that made Amelia Earhart a household name. On May 20th of that year, she became the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic Ocean. She departed from Newfoundland and landed in Northern Ireland nearly 15 hours later, fighting ice, mechanical problems, and her own exhaustion the entire way. When she landed, she became an instant international celebrity. President Herbert Hoover received her at the White House. Congress awarded her the Distinguished Flying Cross. She appeared on magazine covers, gave lectures, wrote books, and became the most famous female aviator in the world. But for Amelia, fame was never the goal. The goal was to prove that women could do anything men could do, and to inspire the next generation to reach higher than society told them they could. By 1937, Amelia Earhart wasn't just a pilot. She was a symbol of progress, of possibility, of breaking barriers that had stood for centuries. And that's precisely why her disappearance would become so much more than just another aviation accident. Enter Fred Noonan. Frederick Joseph Noonan was born in Chicago in 1893. Unlike Amelia, whose celebrity status made her instantly recognisable, Noonan was a behind-the-scenes professional. He'd spent years navigating ships across the Pacific before aviation caught his attention. By the time he met Amelia, he was one of the most experienced Pacific navigators alive, having worked for Pan American Airways charting routes across the most dangerous ocean on Earth. Noonan was meticulous, experienced, and respected in aviation circles. He knew the Pacific like few others did. He understood weather patterns, radio navigation, and the thousand small details that could mean the difference between reaching your destination and disappearing forever. When Amelia began planning her around-the-world flight, she knew she needed someone with Noonan's expertise. The route she'd chosen would take them across some of the most remote stretches of ocean on the planet. There would be no room for error, no second chances. Noonan was the obvious choice. Together, they began preparing for what would become the most ambitious flight of the era. Neither of them could have known they were preparing for something else entirely. A mystery that would outlive them both and spawn theories that would persist for generations. Chapter 2. The World Flight Attempt. The plan was audacious, even by Amelia's standards. She wanted to fly around the world following a route as close to the equator as possible. No one had ever done it before. The journey would cover approximately 29,000 miles and take roughly 1 month to complete. The aircraft chosen for this historic flight was a Lockheed Electra 10E, a twin-engine, all-metal monoplane that represented the cutting edge of aviation technology in 1937. The plane was modified extensively for the journey. Extra fuel tanks were installed, giving it a range of over 4,000 miles. Navigation and radio equipment filled the cabin. Every modification was designed with one goal in mind, keeping Amelia and Fred alive long enough to complete the journey. The route was carefully planned to include stops in South America, Africa, Asia, and various Pacific islands. Each leg of the journey presented its own challenges. Some stretches would take them over dense jungle with no place to land if something went wrong. Others would take them across open ocean for hours at a time. The first attempt began on March 17, 1937, with a westward route starting from Oakland, California. But during a takeoff from Hawaii, the plane ground-looped and suffered substantial damage. The aircraft had to be shipped back to California for repairs. Weeks of preparation, thousands of dollars in expenses, and countless hours of planning seemed wasted. But Amelia wasn't the type to give up. She secured additional funding, had the Electra repaired, and began planning a second attempt. This time she would fly eastward, and this time she was determined to succeed. On June 1st, 1937, Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan departed from Miami, Florida, beginning their second attempt to circumnavigate the globe. This time, everything seemed to go according to plan. They flew to Puerto Rico, then to Venezuela. From South America, they crossed the Atlantic to Africa, stopping in Senegal before continuing to Chad, Sudan, and Eritrea. From Africa, they flew to Pakistan, then to India and Burma. Each stop generated headlines. Newspapers around the world followed their progress. Radio broadcasts updated listeners on their location. Children followed their route on classroom maps. The world was watching. By late June, they'd reached Lae, New Guinea, having completed approximately 22,000 miles of their journey. They had roughly 7,000 miles left to go. The most dangerous stretch still lay ahead, the Pacific Ocean. At Lae, Amelia and Fred prepared for what would be one of the longest and most challenging legs of the entire journey. Their next destination was Howland Island, a tiny speck of land in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Howland Island is so small that missing it would be catastrophically easy. It measures roughly 1.6 miles long and half a mile wide. From the air it would be nearly invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. To help guide them, the United States Coast Guard positioned the cutter Itasca near Howland Island. The Itasca would provide radio navigation assistance and serve as a safety net if anything went wrong. At least that was the plan. On July 2nd, 1937, at 10 minutes past midnight local time, Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan took off from Lae Aerodrome. The Lockheed Electra climbed into the darkness, its twin engines roaring as it headed out over the Pacific. Neither of them would ever be seen again. Chapter 3. The Final Leg. The flight from Lae to Howland Island should have taken approximately 18 hours. The distance was approximately 2,556 miles, almost entirely over open ocean. There would be no landmarks, no visual references, nothing but water stretching to the horizon in every direction. Everything depended on precise navigation and reliable radio contact. From the beginning, there were problems. The radio communication between Amelia's plane and the Itasca was inconsistent at best. The reasons for this remain disputed to this day, but the result was clear. They couldn't establish reliable two-way communication. The Itasca could hear Amelia, but she apparently couldn't hear them, and what the Itasca heard was increasingly concerning. At 02:45 in the morning, the Itasca received a transmission from Amelia stating that the weather was cloudy and overcast. At 03:45 she radioed again, asking the Itasca to take a bearing on her signal. But the transmission was too brief for the Itasca's radio operators to get an accurate reading. As the hours passed, Amelia's transmissions became shorter and more urgent. At 06:14 she reported that they were approximately 200 miles out. Her voice was described as tense but controlled. At 07:42 she transmitted, "We must be on you but cannot see you. Gas is running low. Been unable to reach you by radio." The Itasca's crew scrambled to establish contact, sending smoke signals into the air and transmitting continuous radio signals for Amelia to home in on. But the Electra never appeared on the horizon. At 08:43, Amelia transmitted what would become her final confirmed message. "We are running north and south." This transmission suggested that Amelia and Fred had reached what they believed was Howland Island's position, but couldn't locate the island itself. They were flying a north-south search pattern, burning precious fuel while desperately scanning the ocean for any sign of land. And then, nothing. The radio fell silent. The Electra vanished. By mid-morning it became clear that something had gone catastrophically wrong. The Itasca continued transmitting, hoping for any response. None came. The largest search and rescue operation in history was about to begin, and it would find absolutely nothing. Chapter 4. The Official Explanation. When news of Amelia Earhart's disappearance reached the United States, the response was immediate and massive. This wasn't just any pilot. This was Amelia Earhart, America's sweetheart, an international celebrity, and a personal friend of President Franklin Roosevelt and First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. The United States Navy launched the largest air and sea search conducted up to that point in history. 9 ships and 66 aircraft scoured over 250,000 square miles of the Pacific Ocean. They searched for 17 days, covering an area roughly the size of Texas. They found nothing. No wreckage, no oil slicks, no debris, no bodies. It was as if the Lockheed Electra had simply ceased to exist. On July 19th, 1937, the official search was called off. The Navy had exhausted its resources and found no evidence that Amelia or Fred had survived. The official conclusion was straightforward. The Electra had run out of fuel and crashed into the ocean. The impact would have destroyed the aircraft. The ocean would have swallowed any debris. Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan were declared lost at sea. On January 5th, 1939, Amelia was officially declared dead. The case was closed. The world mourned and moved on, but some people never stopped asking questions. How could an aircraft simply vanish without leaving any trace whatsoever? The Electra was a large metal aircraft. Even if it sank, shouldn't some debris have floated? A seat cushion, a fuel tank, something? And what about those final radio transmissions? Amelia stated they were running north and south, suggesting they were close to Howland Island. If they were that close, how did the Navy miss them? The official explanation satisfied most people, but for others, it raised more questions than it answered. And as years passed and new evidence emerged, those questions would only multiply. Some researchers began pointing out inconsistencies in the official timeline. Others noted that certain documents related to the search had been classified or had mysteriously disappeared. Radio operators who claimed to have received transmissions after the official disappearance were dismissed as mistaken or attention-seeking. The more people looked, the more things didn't quite add up, and that's where the conspiracy theories began to take root. Chapter 5. The Gardner Island Hypothesis. The first major alternative theory emerged relatively quickly after the disappearance. It centred on a remote coral atoll in the Phoenix Islands called Gardner Island, now known as Nikumaroro Island. Nikumaroro is located approximately 350 nautical miles southeast of Howland Island. It's roughly 4 miles long and less than a mile wide, surrounded by a coral reef and covered in thick vegetation. In 1937, it was completely uninhabited. It was also almost exactly along the navigation line Amelia would have been following if she'd overshot Howland Island. The Gardner Island hypothesis suggests that when Amelia and Fred couldn't find Howland Island, they continued flying along their intended line of navigation until they spotted land. According to this theory, they landed on the reef surrounding Nikumaroro, either during low tide when the reef would have been exposed or in a controlled crash landing. The plane would have been intact enough for them to survive initially, but damaged enough that they couldn't take off again. What makes this theory compelling is the evidence that surfaced in the years following the disappearance. In the days immediately after Amelia vanished, multiple radio operators claimed to have received distress signals that they believed came from Earhart's plane. These weren't just random hobbyists. Some were professional radio operators with military or commercial experience. The messages they reported receiving included references to water levels rising, suggesting the plane was on land but being threatened by tides. One of the most intriguing messages was allegedly received by a 15-year-old girl in Florida named Betty Klenk. She claimed to have picked up a transmission saying, "This is Amelia Earhart. Please help me." The message included coordinates and a plea for assistance. At the time, her claims were dismissed. Decades later, researchers would take them more seriously. But the real bombshell came in 1940, 3 years after the disappearance. A British colonial officer named Gerald Gallagher was conducting a survey of Gardner Island as part of a potential settlement project. On the island's southeast end, he discovered human remains, a partial skeleton, a woman's shoe, and a box that had contained a sextant, a navigation tool used by aviators and sailors. Gallagher immediately suspected these might be Earhart's remains. The bones were sent to Fiji for analysis. The examining physician concluded they were from a European male, approximately 5 feet 5 inches tall. Based on this analysis, they couldn't be Amelia's. The bones were eventually lost, making any further analysis impossible, or so everyone thought. In the late 20th century, forensic anthropologists re-examined the original measurements and notes from the 1940 analysis. Using modern techniques, they concluded that the original physician had made errors in his assessment. The bones were actually consistent with a white female of Northern European descent, approximately 5 feet 7 inches tall with a robust build. Amelia Earhart was 5 feet 8 inches tall with a slender but athletic build. Suddenly the bones looked a lot more interesting. Additional expeditions to Nikumaroro in the decades that followed found more tantalizing clues. Researchers discovered artifacts from the 1930s, including what appeared to be remnants of a woman's compact, a zipper pull that matched zippers used on Amelia's flight suits, and pieces of plexiglass consistent with aircraft, windows from that era. In 1991, researchers found what they believed might be part of a heel from a woman's shoe that matched a style Amelia was known to wear. They also found what appeared to be aircraft aluminum and a piece of clear material that could have been from the Electra's windows. None of this evidence is conclusive. Each piece can be explained in other ways. The shoe could have belonged to anyone. The compact could have been left by later visitors. The aircraft parts could have come from different planes that crashed in the area during World War II. But taken together, they form a pattern that's hard to ignore. The question becomes, did Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan survive the initial landing on Gardner Island, only to die there as castaways, slowly succumbing to dehydration, starvation, or injury, while the world searched thousands of miles away? If true, it's one of the cruelest twists imaginable. Help was so close, yet they died alone on a deserted island, their distress calls either unheard or dismissed as hoaxes. But this is only one theory, and some researchers believe the truth is even darker. Chapter 6. The Capture Theory. The second major conspiracy theory takes the story in a much more sinister direction. It suggests that Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan didn't crash on a deserted island. Instead, they strayed into Japanese-controlled territory and were captured. To understand why this theory exists, you need to understand the geopolitical situation in 1937. Japan had been aggressively expanding its influence in the Pacific for years. They'd occupied Manchuria, invaded China, and were fortifying islands throughout the Pacific in violation of international agreements. Relations between Japan and the United States were deteriorating rapidly. Within 4 years, the two nations would be at war. The Marshall Islands, located in the Central Pacific, were under Japanese control at this time. Japan had been granted a mandate over these islands after World War I, but by the 1930s they'd begun militarizing them in secret. Foreign visitors were restricted, maps were classified. Something was happening in the Marshall Islands that Japan didn't want the world to see. The capture theory suggests that Amelia and Fred, either through navigation error or mechanical problems, ended up in the Marshall Islands region. According to this theory, they were taken into custody by Japanese forces who suspected them of being American spies. What evidence exists for this extraordinary claim? The most compelling evidence comes from eyewitness testimony, though it didn't emerge until decades after the war ended. In the 1960s, researchers began interviewing residents of the Marshall Islands who claimed to have seen or heard about a Western man and woman being held by Japanese forces in 1937. A Marshallese woman named Bilamon Amaron claimed she saw Amelia Earhart in 1937 on Jaluit Atoll. She described a white woman with short hair being led from a boat to a building where Japanese officials had their headquarters. The woman matched Amelia's description. A fisherman named Eliu Jibambam reported seeing a plane go down near Mili Atoll in 1937. He claimed Japanese forces recovered the plane and its occupants. His account included specific details about the aircraft that matched the Electra's description. Other witnesses reported seeing a Western woman being held on Saipan, an island that was a major Japanese military base. Some claimed to have seen a grave or graves of Western people who died in Japanese custody during this period. In 1960, a former United States Marine named Robert Wallach claimed that while serving on Saipan after its capture in World War II, he and other Marines discovered a safe containing Amelia Earhart's briefcase and other personal effects. According to Wallach, they were ordered to destroy these materials and never speak of them. Another Marine, Thomas Devine, claimed that his unit found and burned Amelia's Lockheed Electra on Saipan in 1944. He described the aircraft's configuration in detail, including modifications that matched the Electra's specifications. These accounts are controversial. Skeptics point out that the witnesses came forward decades after the events, when memories can be unreliable and contaminated by exposure to media coverage. Many of the accounts contradict each other on specific details. No physical evidence has ever been produced to support these claims, but the sheer number of independent witnesses reporting similar stories is difficult to dismiss entirely. If even a fraction of these accounts are accurate, they paint a disturbing picture. Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan captured by Japanese forces, held in secret, and possibly executed as suspected spies. The Japanese government has always denied any knowledge of Amelia Earhart's fate. Official Japanese records from the period make no mention of capturing American aviators. Of course, many Japanese military records were destroyed in the final days of World War II, making verification impossible. The capture theory raises obvious questions. If Japan captured Amelia, why keep it secret? Wouldn't they have used it for propaganda purposes? Why execute her rather than use her as a bargaining chip? Some theorists suggest Japan realized that capturing and executing America's most famous female aviator would be a diplomatic catastrophe. Better to bury the incident entirely than risk provoking the United States into earlier military action. Others point to the possibility that Amelia wasn't just a civilian pilot, but something more, which brings us to our next theory. Chapter 7. The Espionage Angle. The most controversial theory about Amelia Earhart's disappearance is also the darkest, that her around-the-world flight was actually a cover for a covert reconnaissance mission. According to this theory, Amelia's flight was partially funded and supported by the United States government specifically to allow American intelligence to photograph Japanese military installations in the Pacific. Her celebrity status provided perfect cover. Who would suspect America's sweetheart of espionage? On the surface, this seems absurd. But when you examine the details, some aspects of Amelia's flight do seem unusual for a purely civilian endeavour. First, there's the question of funding. Amelia's flight was expensive, requiring a state-of-the-art aircraft, extensive modifications, support personnel, and supplies stationed around the world. Where did the money come from? Some came from Purdue University, where Amelia worked as careers counsellor and aviation advisor. But researchers have noted that Purdue's funding seemed unusually generous for what was essentially a publicity stunt. Second, there's the route itself. Amelia's planned route would take her very close to several Japanese-held islands, including territories where Japan was suspected of building military installations in violation of international law. Was this coincidence, or careful planning? Third, there's the equipment. The Electra was fitted with more sophisticated radio equipment than would typically be necessary for a civilian flight. Some researchers claim the aircraft had equipment capable of direction finding and even primitive radar, technology that would be useful for reconnaissance but overkill for simple navigation. Fourth, there's Amelia's relationship with the United States government. She was personal friends with the Roosevelts. She had connections to military and intelligence circles through her husband, George Putnam, who had his own government contacts. She'd previously been involved in promoting commercial aviation, an industry with obvious military applications. Fifth, and most intriguingly, there are suggestions that Fred Noonan wasn't just a navigator. Some researchers claim he had intelligence connections through his work with Pan American Airways, which was known to share information with American intelligence services as it expanded routes across the Pacific. The espionage theory suggests that Amelia's mission was to fly close to Japanese-held islands, photographing installations and gathering intelligence about Japan's military build-up. The theory further suggests that something went wrong. Either the plane experienced mechanical problems, or the Japanese detected the flight and forced it down. Either way, Amelia and Fred ended up in Japanese custody, where they were interrogated and eventually executed. The United States government, according to this theory, could never admit the truth. Acknowledging that they'd sent America's most beloved aviator on a spy mission would have been a public relations disaster. Better to let the world believe it was a tragic accident than admit they deliberately placed Amelia in harm's way. What evidence supports this theory? Mostly circumstantial connections and suspicious gaps in the official record. Several documents related to Amelia's flight remain classified to this day, more than 80 years after her disappearance. Why would routine documents about a civilian flight need to remain secret? What could they possibly contain that still requires protection? Some researchers point to statements made by officials years later that seem to hint at hidden truths. Paul Mantz, a stunt pilot who helped prepare Amelia's plane, allegedly told friends that the government was involved in the flight in ways that weren't publicly acknowledged. He never elaborated before his death in 1965. Jacqueline Cochran, another famous female aviator and friend of Amelia's, reportedly told researchers she believed Amelia had been on some kind of government thing. Again, she provided no details. The espionage theory is the hardest to prove and the easiest to dismiss as conspiracy thinking. It requires believing that the United States government would risk Amelia Earhart's life for intelligence gathering, then maintain an elaborate cover-up for decades. It requires believing that dozens of people knew the truth but kept silent. It requires accepting that official records have been deliberately falsified or suppressed. Yet intelligence agencies are capable of exactly these kinds of operations. History has shown us countless examples of governments conducting covert missions, sacrificing assets, and maintaining secrecy for generations. Is it really so impossible that Amelia Earhart was one of those assets? The truth is, we may never know. If the espionage theory is correct, the evidence is buried so deep that it may never surface, and that's exactly what makes it so compelling to conspiracy theorists. The absence of evidence becomes evidence of a successful cover-up. Chapter 8. The radio messages. One of the most perplexing aspects of the Amelia Earhart mystery is the radio messages allegedly received after her disappearance. If the plane crashed immediately into the ocean as the official story suggests, These messages should be impossible, yet dozens of people claim to have received them. The messages began almost immediately after the Itasca lost contact with Amelia on July 2nd. Within hours, radio operators around the Pacific reported picking up distress signals. Some were clear, others were fragmentary, but they shared common elements. A female voice, references to Amelia Earhart and pleas for help. Walter McMenemy, a radio operator in San Francisco, reported receiving a signal on Amelia's frequency saying, "SOS from Earhart, position unavailable, can't hold out much longer." He immediately reported it to authorities. They dismissed it as either a hoax or atmospheric interference. In Rock Springs, Wyoming, a housewife named Nina Paxton reported hearing a woman say, "This is Amelia Earhart. Ship is on reef south of equator." Paxton had been an experienced radio operator and insisted the message was genuine. The Clenk message, mentioned earlier, included even more specific information, coordinates, references to water levels, and mentions of Fred Noonan being injured. Betty Clenk wrote down everything she heard and told her father, who contacted authorities. They took a report but apparently did nothing with it. Perhaps most intriguingly, a radio operator in Los Angeles claimed to have received multiple messages over several days. These messages suggested the plane was on land somewhere, that water levels were rising and falling with the tides, and that the situation was becoming desperate. If even a fraction of these messages were genuine, they completely change our understanding of what happened. They suggest Amelia and Fred survived the initial landing. They suggest the plane was intact enough to transmit. They suggest they were somewhere on land, being threatened by tides, slowly running out of time while their distress calls went unheeded. But here's where it gets complicated. The Itasca, with its powerful receivers and experienced radio operators, heard nothing after Amelia's final transmission. The Navy ship searching for her heard nothing. The official search and rescue frequencies were silent. How could civilian operators be picking up signals that the military couldn't detect? Skeptics point to several possibilities. Some of the messages could have been outright hoaxes. In 1937, Amelia Earhart was famous enough that pretending to be her would have guaranteed attention. Some people might have done it for fun or fame. Other messages might have been misidentifications. Radio in the 1930s was filled with static, interference, and crosstalk from other transmissions. It would be easy for an operator to hear fragments of different transmissions and mentally construct them into a coherent message from Amelia Earhart. There's also the phenomenon of mass suggestion. Once newspapers reported that people were receiving messages from Amelia, more people started listening for them. The human brain is excellent at finding patterns even when they don't exist. Ambiguous signals could easily be interpreted as meaningful messages by people who desperately wanted to hear them. But what if some of the messages were real? Modern analysis of the Clenk message has found some intriguing elements. The coordinates she wrote down place a location in the Phoenix Islands, close to Gardner Island. The reference to water levels and tides is consistent with a plane on a reef. The timing of the messages spread over several days is consistent with survivors slowly succumbing to the elements. Some researchers have suggested that Amelia's radio could have transmitted under specific conditions even if it couldn't receive, if the plane was damaged but the radio equipment was intact, and if they had battery power, short transmissions would have been possible. These transmissions might have been weak enough that only certain receivers, under certain atmospheric conditions, could pick them up. The radio messages raise an agonizing possibility that Amelia and Fred survived for days after the disappearance, calling for help that never came, that their messages were heard but dismissed, that they died slowly, knowing people had heard them but didn't believe them, or perhaps the messages were all fantasies, coincidences and hoaxes, and Amelia and Fred died quickly in the crash. We may never know which interpretation is correct. Chapter 9. The Disappearing Evidence. As researchers have dug deeper into the Amelia Earhart mystery over the decades, they've encountered a frustrating pattern. Evidence that should exist doesn't. Documents that should be available have vanished. Records that should clarify the situation instead create more confusion. Consider the official search records. The Navy conducted the largest search operation in history up to that point. involving 9 ships and 66 aircraft over 17 days. Surely detailed records were kept of every search pattern, every area covered, every signal received or investigated. Yet when researchers request these records, they find gaps. Some documents were destroyed in routine purges of old records. Others are classified for reasons that aren't explained. Still others exist but are heavily redacted, with entire sections blacked out. Why would search and rescue records need to be classified more than 80 years after the fact? Then there are the navigation logs. Fred Noonan was known for keeping meticulous records of every flight. His navigation logs would have been crucial for understanding exactly what route they took and where they might have ended up. Yet none of Noonan's logs from the around-the-world flight have ever been found. They either weren't recovered from the plane, which seems unlikely, or they were recovered and subsequently lost or destroyed. The bone analysis from Gardner Island presents another puzzle. The bones found in 1940 were examined, measured, and documented. Then they were lost. How do you lose evidence in one of the most famous missing persons cases in history? The loss means modern forensic techniques can never be applied to the actual remains, only to the measurements and notes from the original examination. Radio logs present similar problems. Several radio operators kept detailed logs of the signals they received in the days following Amelia's disappearance. Some of these logs still exist, others have vanished. When researchers tried to trace what happened to them, they hit dead ends. The logs were filed somewhere, then at some point they weren't filed anymore. Perhaps most frustratingly, official explanations for Amelia's disappearance have shifted over time in ways that seem designed to discourage investigation. Initially, authorities took the post-disappearance radio signals seriously enough to redirect search efforts based on them. Later, these same signals were dismissed as impossible. Early reports suggested the search covered certain areas. Later analysis shows those areas might not have been searched as thoroughly as claimed. Conspiracy theorists see a pattern in these disappearances and contradictions. They suggest that evidence has been systematically suppressed to hide the truth about what really happened to Amelia Earhart. They point out that if she was on a government mission, any evidence of that fact would need to be eliminated. Skeptics counter that the pattern is exactly what you'd expect from an incident that occurred more than 80 years ago. Records get lost, priorities change, memory fades, organizations purge old files to make room for new ones. There doesn't need to be a conspiracy to explain why documentation is incomplete, but even skeptics admit that some of the gaps are puzzling. The bone loss in particular seems difficult to explain through normal bureaucratic incompetence. These were bones that multiple parties believed might belong to Amelia Earhart. They should have been treated as crucial evidence, yet they disappeared. The missing evidence creates a situation where almost any theory becomes possible, because there's not enough solid information to definitively disprove any of them. Did Amelia crash into the ocean? Maybe. Did she land on Gardner Island? The lost bones might have told us. Was she captured by Japan? The missing documents might have revealed the truth. In the absence of conclusive evidence, the mystery persists, and with it, the theories multiply. Chapter 10. Why the mystery endures. More than 80 years after Amelia Earhart's final flight, her disappearance continues to captivate the public imagination in ways that other aviation mysteries don't. Planes have disappeared before and since. People have vanished without explanation. But Amelia's story refuses to fade. Why? Part of the answer lies in who Amelia was. She wasn't just a pilot. She was a cultural icon, a symbol of progress and possibility in an era when such symbols were desperately needed. The 1930s were hard years. The Great Depression had devastated economies worldwide. Political tensions were rising. War loomed on the horizon. In that darkness, Amelia Earhart was a light. She represented hope, courage, and the idea that barriers could be broken. When she disappeared, it felt like more than just a person vanishing. It felt like a promise broken. The narrative was supposed to end with triumph, not tragedy. She was supposed to succeed, inspire millions, and prove that women could achieve anything. Instead, she simply vanished, leaving the story unfinished. human beings hate unfinished stories. We're pattern-seeking creatures who need closure and resolution. Amelia's disappearance denies us that closure. There's no body, no wreckage, no final message, just silence and an endless ocean. Our minds reject this lack of conclusion and desperately search for explanations that provide the resolution the facts don't offer. The conspiracy theories persist because they provide that resolution. Whether it's the Gardner Island hypothesis, the capture theory, or the espionage angle, each gives us an ending. They tell us what happened, even if we can't prove it. They replace uncertainty with narrative, even if that narrative is dark. There's also the element of government secrecy. We know governments keep secrets. We know intelligence agencies conduct covert operations. We know official explanations aren't always truthful. The Amelia Earhart case has all the elements that make conspiracy theories thrive. Government involvement, classified documents, missing evidence, and official explanations that leave questions unanswered. In an era when faith in institutions has declined and skepticism toward official narratives has increased, the Earhart mystery becomes a perfect canvas for people to project their distrust. Every gap in the evidence, every contradiction in the official story, every classified document becomes potential proof that we're being lied to. But there's something else at work too. The Pacific Ocean is vast beyond comprehension. It covers more than 60 million square miles. In 1937, much of it was completely unexplored. Even today, with satellites and modern technology, we understand the ocean floor less well than we understand the surface of Mars. If Amelia's plane crashed into deep water, it could be anywhere within an area of hundreds of thousands of square miles. The wreckage could be thousands of feet down, buried in sediment, corroded beyond recognition, or scattered across miles of ocean floor. Finding it would be like finding a specific grain of sand on a beach. The absence of wreckage isn't necessarily evidence of a conspiracy. It might just be evidence of how impossibly difficult it is to find something small in something vast. Yet even knowing this, we can't let go. New expeditions to Nicomaroro find new artifacts and reignite debates. New witnesses come forward with old stories. New researchers propose new theories. Technology advances, and someone suggests applying it to the Earhart mystery. The search continues, decade after decade, because giving up feels like abandoning Amelia herself. The mystery endures because Amelia Earhart matters. She mattered in 1937, and she matters now. She represents not just one woman's courage, but the courage of everyone who's ever pushed beyond what society said was possible. Her disappearance can't just be accepted. It demands answers, even if those answers never come. And so the theories proliferate, the expeditions continue, the debates rage on, the mystery deepens rather than resolves because every answer leads to 3 more questions, and every piece of evidence can be interpreted in multiple ways. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere between the official explanation and the wildest conspiracy theory. Perhaps Amelia and Fred did crash into the ocean, but not where anyone searched. Perhaps they did reach Gardner Island but died before anyone could rescue them. Perhaps some elements of the capture theory are true, but not the entire narrative. Perhaps there was government involvement, but not in the way theorists imagine. Or perhaps the official story is correct, and everything else is just our inability to accept that sometimes bad things happen randomly, without meaning or purpose or conspiracy. We may never know. The witnesses are dead. The documents are lost or classified. The evidence is scattered across an ocean floor we can't fully search. Time has erased too much. The trail has gone cold, but we keep looking anyway. Because that's what Amelia would have wanted. She didn't give up when people told her women couldn't fly. She didn't give up when her first around-the-world attempt failed. She kept pushing forward, kept trying, kept believing that the impossible was just difficult. And so we keep searching for her, even knowing we may never find the answers we seek. Because finding those answers isn't really the point anymore. The point is refusing to forget. The point is honouring her memory by refusing to accept the silence. The point is keeping her story alive, even if that story has no ending. Epilogue. The last signal. Somewhere in the vast Pacific, The wreckage of a Lockheed Electra might rest in darkness and pressure that would crush any attempt to reach it. Or perhaps on a remote coral island, beneath decades of vegetation growth, lie the final remains of two people who died calling for help that never came. Or perhaps in a forgotten corner of some Japanese archive, a file exists that would explain everything but will never be found. The Pacific keeps its secrets. The ocean swallows stories and gives back only silence. Amelia Earhart's last confirmed words were, "We're running north and south." A simple statement of fact, a description of a search pattern, nothing poetic or profound, just information transmitted in the hope that someone was listening. Someone was listening. The Itasca's radio operators heard her clearly. They just couldn't help. They didn't know where she was. They couldn't guide her home. They could only listen as her voice faded into static and disappeared forever. That might be the saddest part of the entire story. She didn't vanish in complete silence. She was heard. People knew she was in trouble. They just couldn't reach her in time. Some mysteries endure not because they lack answers, but because the answers never arrived when they mattered. The truth about what happened to Amelia Earhart might exist somewhere, in some form, waiting to be discovered. But even if we find it tomorrow, it comes too late to save her. Too late to send rescue. Too late to bring her home. All we can do is remember. Remember who she was. Remember what she represented. Remember that on July 2nd, 1937, a woman who defied every limitation society placed on her flew out over an ocean that had swallowed countless ships and planes before her. And she did it because someone had to be first. Someone had to try. Someone had to believe that the impossible was just difficult. The Pacific never gave her back. But it never made us forget her either. And maybe that's enough. Maybe being remembered, even in mystery, even in theories and speculation and endless questions, is better than being forgotten in certainty. Maybe Amelia Earhart's greatest flight isn't the one that ended somewhere over the Pacific, but the one that continues in our collective memory, never landing, never ending, always searching for Howland Island just beyond the horizon. The last signal has long since faded, but we're still listening, and we always will be. Before we begin, if you're enjoying this deep dive into one of history's most forbidden mysteries, hit that hype button and let the algorithm know this is the kind of content you want to see more of. And if you feel like it, drop a comment telling us what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from, whether you're wide awake at noon or drifting off at 3 a.m. halfway across the globe. Your comments make this community what it is. And a massive thank you to Dogface680 for suggesting this topic. This one's going to take us somewhere we've never been before. Now, let's talk about the Anunnaki. The discovery. Every civilization tells the same story. Gods came from the sky, created mankind, and vanished. In the spring of 2024, An archaeologist named Daniel Reeves found something buried beneath that story, and it nearly destroyed him. Picture this: a research dig outside Eridu, Iraq, the world's first recorded city. The desert stretches endlessly in all directions, broken only by ancient mounds that hide the foundations of humanity's earliest experiments with civilization. The heat's oppressive, the kind that makes you question every decision that led you to this moment. Dust devils spin across the landscape, and the horizon shimmers with mirages that look like water but promise only more sand. Reeves was part of a small, privately funded team excavating a Sumerian temple foundation. The funding came from a tech entrepreneur fascinated by ancient history, the kind of money that let them work without the usual constraints of academic bureaucracy or government oversight. Just 6 people, Reeves as lead archaeologist, 2 graduate students named Tom Chen and Lisa Okafor, a site surveyor named James Whitmore, a translator named Amelia Hassan, who specialised in ancient Sumerian, and a documentary filmmaker named Kevin Park, who was supposed to be capturing the dig for a future series about archaeological discoveries. The work was methodical, painstaking, the kind of thing that usually yields pottery shards and temple receipts, the mundane paperwork of ancient bureaucracy. They'd been at it for 6 weeks, mapping the temple foundation, cataloguing fragments of clay tablets, photographing everything in meticulous detail. Standard archaeology, the kind that builds careers slowly and carefully. But on a Tuesday morning in late March, everything changed. They were excavating what should have been a storage room on the eastern side of the temple complex. Lisa was working with a brush and small hand tools, carefully removing sediment that had accumulated over 45 centuries. She hit something solid, heard the scrape of metal on stone. Not unusual. Plenty of stones in ancient foundations. But this stone was different. It was too smooth, too regular. She called Reeves over. He knelt beside her, examined the surface she had exposed. It was limestone, but worked with a precision that seemed unusual for the period. The surface had been ground flat, polished to a mirror smoothness that would have required significant effort and sophisticated technique. And there were marks on it, shallow grooves that might have been decorative or might have been something else. "Keep going," Reeves said. "Let's see what we have." 3 hours later, they'd exposed a stone slab nearly 2 meters on each side, set flush into the floor. The grooves formed a pattern, geometric and deliberate, spiralling from the edges toward the center where a circular depression suggested some kind of mechanism or seal. Amira examined the grooves carefully, running her fingers along them, feeling the depth and spacing. "These aren't decorative," she said. "They're inscriptions, but I don't recognize the script. It's older than standard cuneiform, more pictographic. Proto-writing maybe, or something else entirely." Tom set up the ground-penetrating radar while Lisa and Kevin documented everything with photographs and video. The GPR results came back showing a void beneath the stone slab, a chamber roughly 4 meters deep and extending 6 meters in each direction. "We need to open it," Reeves said. Nobody argued. They worked for 2 days, carefully prying up the stone slab with jacks and leverage, afraid of damaging whatever was beneath. When it finally lifted free, the smell hit them first. Not decay or rot, but something else, something metallic and sharp that made their eyes water. The air from the chamber below was different, processed through stone for millennia, sealed away from the world above. James rigged lighting and lowered it into the chamber. The lights came on, and everyone gathered around the opening to look. The chamber was lined with stone blocks, each carved with inscriptions that covered every surface. The writing was dense, layered, some characters carved over others as if someone had run out of space and kept adding more information. But that wasn't what made them all stop and stare in silence. On the far wall, illuminated by their temporary lights, was a massive carving nearly 2 meters tall. 2 figures, humanoid, but not quite human. Their proportions were wrong, legs too long, arms too angular, heads slightly too large. They wore fitted garments that looked more like flight suits than ancient robes, covered in geometric patterns that might have been decorative or might have been functional. And they were holding tablets, not clay tablets. These tablets glowed in the carving, represented with a luminescence that had been achieved by inlaying the stone with some kind of crystalline material that caught the light and scattered it. The tablets were covered in grid patterns, regular arrangements of squares that looked less like writing and more like circuit boards, like technology rendered in stone by people who shouldn't have had any concept of such things. "Get down there," Reeves told Tom and Kevin. "Document everything. Every angle, every inscription, everything." They spent the next 3 days in that chamber. The inscriptions covered not just the walls but the floor and ceiling, a complete enclosure of information. Amelia worked herself to exhaustion trying to translate, filling notebooks with sketches and notes, consulting references on her laptop, comparing characters to known Sumerian texts. The dating came back from samples they'd carefully extracted. 4,500 years before the Common Era, give or take a century. That would make it contemporary with the very founding of Sumerian civilization, possibly even earlier. Contemporary with the moment when humans supposedly first figured out writing and agriculture and organised religion. But the inscriptions didn't read like early writing. They read like something mature, developed, technical. Then came the pigment analysis. The crystalline material inlaid in the carved tablets contained trace amounts of iridium, a metal rarely found on Earth's surface. Iridium comes from space, from meteor impacts, or from deep in the planet's core where it sank billions of years ago when the Earth was molten. You don't find it in surface deposits. You don't mine it with ancient technology. You don't accidentally incorporate it into artwork, unless someone brought it from somewhere else. Reeves documented everything methodically. He took hundreds of photographs from every angle, collected samples of the stone and the inlay material, filled 3 hard drives with video footage and data files. His field notes, later leaked through a series of encrypted emails to contacts at the British Museum, contained observations that read less like archaeology and more like science fiction. One entry, dated March 28th, 2024. The inscriptions refer to the design of life, not as a gift, but as a project. They mention something called the model of the clay, which reads like an instruction manual for genetic creation. The figures aren't gods receiving worship. They're scientists documenting an experiment. Another entry, March 30th. Translation of Chamber Wall, Section 4. The pattern was set into the clay, ratio 7:3, aligned with the breath sequence. 23 pairs achieved stability. The creation walked and spoke and remembered instruction. This isn't poetry. It's a procedure. 23 pairs. The human genome contains 23 pairs of chromosomes. Nobody in 4500 BCE should have known that. Nobody should have even understood what chromosomes were, let alone how to count them. The breath sequence. DNA requires specific base pair sequences to function, patterns that repeat in rhythms, instructions written in chemical notation that wouldn't be discovered for another 5,000 years. The creation walked and spoke and remembered. Higher cognitive function, language capability, memory formation, the defining characteristics of human consciousness, described in clinical terms by people who shouldn't have had the framework to think in those terms. Kevin captured all of it on video. Hours of footage, wide shots and close-ups. Amelia translating in real time, Reeves examining the inscriptions with increasingly frantic energy as he realised what they might be looking at. That was the last official transmission from the dig site. On April 2nd, 2024, Reeves uploaded his field notes to an encrypted cloud server and sent copies to 3 colleagues he trusted. On April 3rd, he tried to contact the British Museum to arrange a consultation with their Sumerian experts. On April 4th, the dig site was shut down. After that, just static. Act 1. The official story. To understand what happened next, we need to understand what the Anunnaki actually are, at least according to the accepted historical record. The Anunnaki appear throughout Sumerian, Akkadian, Assyrian, and Babylonian mythology as the pantheon of major gods who shape the world and humanity's place in it. The word itself breaks down in Sumerian. Anu, referring to the sky or heaven, and Kai, meaning earth, with the connecting Na, suggesting descent or origin. They are literally those who from heaven to earth came. There's Anu, the Sky Father, the ultimate authority among the gods, remote and powerful, sitting in judgment over both divine and human affairs. There's Enki, god of wisdom, water and creation, portrayed as the craftsman who shaped humanity, who gave us intelligence and knowledge, who often intervened on behalf of his creations against harsher gods. And there's Enlil, god of air and command, who saw humans as a necessary workforce but little more, who advocated for humanity's destruction when we became too numerous and noisy. These aren't obscure figures mentioned in a single text. Thousands of clay tablets recovered from sites across ancient Mesopotamia mention them, describe their actions, catalogue their relationships and conflicts. The Epic of Gilgamesh references them. The Atrahasis epic describes them in detail. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation myth, places them at the centre of cosmic order. Museums around the world house these artefacts. The British Museum, the Louvre, the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology, the National Museum of Iraq. Translations exist, peer-reviewed and documented by Assyriologists who've spent entire careers studying these texts. This is established historical fact, at least as much as anything from 5,000 years ago can be called fact. The standard interpretation treats them as mythology, as primitive humans attempt to explain the world through storytelling and supernatural agency. Ancient people didn't understand natural phenomena, didn't know about weather patterns or geological processes or biological evolution, so they invented gods to explain what they saw. The Anunnaki were powerful beings who controlled things humans couldn't control, who provided order and meaning to an otherwise chaotic existence. Standard mythology, right? The kind of creation story every ancient culture has. Gods make humans, humans worship gods, everyone knows their place. The Sumerians weren't special in this regard. Every civilization from the Greeks to the Maya to the Norse had pantheons of powerful beings who created the world and shaped human destiny. Except the Sumerian texts are remarkably specific about certain details. They describe the Anunnaki coming to Earth with specific purposes, mining operations in southern Africa according to some texts, agricultural development in Mesopotamia according to others. They needed workers for their projects, labour that could perform complex tasks but remain under control, so they created humans. The Sumerian term is Adamu, the first man, created to serve, but the creation process is described with unusual precision. Enki, the god of wisdom and creation, took the clay of the earth and mixed it with the essence of the gods, combining earthly matter with divine substance in specific ratios to create something new. One text describes it this way: "In the clay, God and man shall be bound, to a unity brought together, so that to the end of days the flesh and the soul, which in a god have ripened, that soul in a blood kinship be bound." Clay and blood, earth and essence, physical matter and genetic information, instructions for creating life by combining existing biological material with new patterns, new code. And here's where Daniel Reeves's field notes started to sound less like fanciful interpretation and more like genuine alarm, because the inscriptions in that sealed chamber described the same process, but in language that read less like mythology and more like technical documentation. One section, laboriously translated by Amira Hassan over 3 exhausting days. The clay was refined through 7 passes, removing impurities, establishing baseline compatibility. The essence was introduced in measured proportion, 7 parts clay to 3 parts essence. The ratio determined through prior testing on lesser forms. 23 binding pairs were established, each pair encoding specific function, structure, cognition, reproduction, lifespan regulation, sensory input processing, motor control, metabolic efficiency. 7:3 ratio, 23 pairs, specific functions encoded in binding pairs. This wasn't poetry, this wasn't metaphor, this was a procedure, written by someone who understood genetics at a level that shouldn't have been possible for people working in 4500 BCE. Another section described outcomes. Initial trials produced unstable forms, insufficient cognitive capability, shortened lifespan, inadequate reproductive compatibility. Adjustments were made to binding sequences, enhanced neural pathways, extended telomere structures, improved protein synthesis efficiency. Final, form achieved stability after 47 iterations. 47 iterations. Trial and error. Scientific method. Someone was refining a process, learning from failures, improving results through systematic experimentation. The standard interpretation of Anunnaki mythology involves gods moulding humans from clay, like a sculptor working with raw material. But Reeves had found something that suggested those ancient myths were preserving memory of something real, something that actually happened. Not spiritual creation, but biological engineering. Not divine magic, but applied science by beings who understood genetics and molecular biology in ways that humans wouldn't rediscover for thousands of years, and someone noticed that he'd found it. Aced 2. The cover-up. Within 72 hours of Reeves's last field note upload, the excavation was shut down. The sequence of events moved with the kind of efficiency that suggested someone had been monitoring the dig closely and was ready to act the moment something specific was discovered. April 4th, 9:30 in the morning local time. 2 vehicles arrived at the dig site, one from the Iraqi Department of Antiquities, one from a private American contractor called Archon Geosolutions. 6 men total, carrying documents and wearing professional business clothes completely inappropriate for the desert heat. The man from the Department of Antiquities, whose name was listed as Hakim Rashid in the documents, but whose actual identity remained unclear, informed Reeves that the excavation was being shut down immediately. The stated reasons: site contamination from improper handling of artifacts, excavation beyond permitted boundaries, failure to properly document chain of custody for samples removed from the site, and concerns about damage to culturally significant materials. Reeves tried to argue. He showed them the documentation, the photographs, the meticulous records they'd kept. He explained that they'd followed every protocol, exceeded every standard for archaeological preservation, done everything by the book and then some. Rashid was unmoved. The decision had been made at higher levels, he explained. There was nothing he could do. The site would be sealed pending further investigation. The men from Archon Geosolutions said nothing. They just stood there in their business, casual clothes and reflective sunglasses, watching, waiting for the conversation to end so they could begin their work. "What's Archon's involvement?" Reeves asked. "This is an archaeological site under Iraqi jurisdiction. Why is a private American contractor here?" Rashid's face tightened slightly. "Archon has a contract with the ministry to provide technical assessment and remediation services for sites that may present environmental or safety concerns. Their involvement is routine and appropriate." It wasn't routine, it wasn't appropriate. American contractors don't show up within hours of a discovery unless they were already close, already watching, already prepared to intervene. Within 6 hours, Archon had cordoned off the entire excavation area with security fencing and warning signs. They brought in equipment, sophisticated gear that looked more like military tech than archaeological tools, ground-penetrating radar arrays, electromagnetic scanning equipment, atmospheric sampling devices, all set up with practiced efficiency by technicians who clearly did this regularly. the team wasn't allowed back to the site. They watched from a distance as the chamber they'd discovered was accessed by Archon personnel wearing full environmental suits, the kind you'd use for hazardous materials or biological containment. Everything they'd found, samples, hard drives, notebooks, equipment, was confiscated as evidence in the ongoing investigation. Reeves managed to keep his laptop and one backup drive that he'd hidden in his tent. Everything else was gone. By April 7th, the entire team was in Baghdad being processed for departure. Their visas were suddenly found to have administrative irregularities. Their permits were under review pending investigation into the violations at the site. They needed to return to their countries of origin immediately and await further instructions. Tom Chen, Lisa Okafor and James Whitmore took the hint. They flew home, understanding that arguing would only make things worse for their careers. Kevin Park went back to South Korea, his footage and equipment confiscated, his documentary dead before it started. Amira Hassan, being Iraqi, stayed in Baghdad but was told in no uncertain terms that discussing the excavation publicly would result in consequences for both her and her family. She went quiet. Only Daniel Reeves refused to let it go. Back in London, he tried to make sense of what had happened. He had his backup drive with copies of most of the photographs and his field notes, enough to remember what they'd found, even if he couldn't prove it anymore. He reached out to colleagues, tried to piece together who had the power to shut down an excavation that quickly and thoroughly. Most people told him to let it go. He'd screwed up the politics somehow, probably by not properly coordinating with Iraqi authorities before going too deep. Or maybe the funding source was problematic. Maybe the tech entrepreneur who'd backed them had enemies who wanted to cause trouble. Or maybe, most likely, he'd simply gotten unlucky and stumbled into some bureaucratic turf war between Iraqi agencies. Just drop it, they said. Take the loss, learn from it, move on to the next project. Academia was full of dead ends and political complications. This wasn't unusual. This was just how things went sometimes. But one person listened. Rachel Monroe was an investigative journalist who specialised in the shadowy spaces where government secrecy, military operations and private contractors overlapped. She'd covered the looting of the Iraqi National Museum after the 2003 invasion, had traced stolen artefacts through black markets from Baghdad to London to New York. She'd exposed private military companies running protection rackets at archaeological sites, documented the systematic destruction of cultural heritage under the cover of conflict. When Reeves contacted her through an encrypted messaging app, she was sceptical. Another archaeologist angry about losing funding, probably. Another academic with a conspiracy theory about governments hiding history. She'd heard it all before, the stories about suppressed evidence and secret knowledge. Almost always nonsense. Then Reeves showed her the iridium analysis. He showed her the photographs of inscriptions that describe genetics in a way that shouldn't have been possible in 4500 BCE. He showed her the carbon dating results, and the pigment composition reports, and the translation notes that read like laboratory procedures. Monroe's skepticism turned into curiosity. She started asking questions, making calls, digging through databases and public records, looking for information about Archon Geo Solutions. What she found was a maze of shell companies and classification barriers, but the outline was clear enough to be troubling. Archon Geo Solutions was, on paper, a geological surveying and environmental consulting firm based in McLean, Virginia. They had contracts throughout the Middle East, concentrated heavily in Iraq, doing site assessments for construction projects and infrastructure development. Their website showed smiling engineers in hard hats, satellite imagery of terrain analysis, corporate language about safety and efficiency and cutting-edge technology. Standard corporate work, nothing suspicious on the surface. But Monroe had her sources in the intelligence community, people who leaked when they felt the public deserved to know what was happening in their name. She started asking about Archon specifically, about their work in Iraq, about what they were really doing under the cover of geological surveys. One source, a former contractor who'd worked in Baghdad and gotten disillusioned with the whole operation, gave her enough to start tracing the money. Archon's primary funding didn't come from construction companies or infrastructure projects. It came through a series of shell companies that eventually led back to a bioinformatics research group with ties to DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, the Pentagon's Science and Technology Development Arm. The research group had been active in Baghdad since 2003, right after the invasion, operating under various cover identities and corporate fronts. Their stated research focus, in the few classified documents Monroe could access through her sources, comparative genomics and non-terrestrial isotopic DNA studies. Non-terrestrial, as in not from Earth. Monroe obtained leaked satellite imagery of the Eridu site, taken before and after the shutdown. Before the shutdown, the excavation showed a typical dig pattern, organised grid squares, careful systematic exposure of the archaeological layers, standard academic work. After the shutdown, thermal imaging revealed extensive underground scanning operations. The equipment signatures matched deep penetration ground mapping systems, the kind used to map subterranean structures without excavation, to find caves and tunnels and voids deep below the surface. Archon wasn't covering up the site. They were exploring it further, going deeper, looking for something else, and they didn't want witnesses. Monroe got one more piece of the puzzle through a source at the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. Archon had requested and received updated satellite coverage of a specific area around Eridu, continuous monitoring that went far beyond what a simple geological survey would require. The coverage extended for kilometres in all directions, high-resolution thermal and electromagnetic spectrum analysis, updated every 6 hours. They were looking for something specific, some kind of signature or anomaly that required constant monitoring. And whatever it was important enough to justify shutting down an archaeological dig and classifying everything Reeves had found. Someone wasn't trying to hide the past, Monroe said when she and Reeves met in a quiet London pub to compare notes. They were trying to reclaim it. Whatever the Anunnaki left behind, whoever they actually were, someone thinks it's valuable enough to bury under classification and corporate fronts. Reeves looked at the documents spread across the table between them, the shell company connections and satellite imagery and leaked memos. So what do we do? Monroe smiled, the kind of smile that meant she'd already decided to do something dangerous. We find out what else they've found. If Eridu was shut down this quickly, there must be other sites, other discoveries that got buried, a pattern we can trace. She pulled out a map of the Middle East, marked with archaeological sites from Syria to Iran. Let's see where else the gods came from the sky. Act 3. The pattern. Reeves and Monroe spent the next 6 weeks building a database of archaeological discoveries in the Middle East that had been shut down, classified, or disappeared under suspicious circumstances. The pattern emerged quickly once they knew what to look for. In 1994, a joint Turkish-German team excavating near the ancient city of Harran in southern Turkey uncovered a series of stone tablets with inscriptions that predated known Sumerian writing. The tablets described a gathering place, a garden where the gods instructed the first humans in agriculture, law, and proper worship. The texts were remarkably detailed, describing irrigation techniques that wouldn't be developed until centuries later, astronomical observations that required sophisticated mathematics, medical procedures that suggested anatomical knowledge beyond what primitive cultures should have possessed. The excavation was shut down within 3 weeks. Officially, the closure was due to funding issues and concerns about political instability in the region, since Harran sat near the Syrian border in an area with a history of ethnic tensions. The tablets were transferred to Turkish government archives in Ankara for preservation and further study, but they never appeared in any published research, no peer-reviewed papers, no museum exhibitions. The Turkish government claimed the tablets were too fragile for display, too poorly preserved for reliable translation. A few photographs existed in preliminary reports, but the tablets themselves vanished into climate-controlled storage and were never seen again. Monroe traced the excavation permits and found something interesting. The dig had been partially funded by a grant from an educational foundation based in Switzerland, an organisation that claimed to support international archaeological research and cultural preservation. That foundation received its funding from a consortium of private donors whose identities were protected by Swiss privacy laws. But one of those donors had been careless with their paperwork. A tax filing from 1996 showed a charitable donation to the foundation from a holding company that eventually traced back to the same network that funded Archangeo Solutions. Someone had been paying attention to Harran. Someone had been close enough to shut it down when the tablets were discovered. The Syrian site came next in their research. In 2001, a French archaeological mission working near Tel Brak in northern Syria discovered a chamber beneath an ancient temple, similar to what Reeves had found at Eridu. The chamber contained carved images of figures descending from the sky in vehicles that were described in the field notes as brilliance that moves, craft that shone like stars and moved with purpose rather than drifting like celestial objects. The carvings showed these vehicles opening, figures emerging who were clearly not human despite their generally humanoid shape. The proportions were wrong, the features subtly off, the way they stood and moved captured in stone in ways that suggested the carvers were working from observation rather than imagination. Local Syrian authorities seized the findings within days, citing concerns about looting and the need to protect culturally significant materials. The chamber was resealed, the site was declared off limits, and the French team was expelled from the country under accusations of attempting to smuggle artifacts. No peer-reviewed paper was ever published. The French team members who worked on the dig had to sign non-disclosure agreements with their own government before they could leave Syria, a highly unusual requirement that suggested pressure from higher levels than just academic archaeology. Monroe found one of those team members, a retired archaeologist named Claude Mercier living in a small village in Brittany. He was willing to talk carefully about what they'd actually found. The vehicles were rendered with technical precision, Mercier explained in French, which Monroe translated as they spoke. Not mythological or symbolic. These were craft with specific features, landing mechanisms, what looked like propulsion systems, and the figures emerging from them were carrying containers, equipment, tools. They weren't gods receiving worship. They were a team arriving to do a job. What kind of job? Monroe asked. Mercier shrugged. The inscriptions around the image described the beginning of instruction. The gods, or whatever they were, teaching humans about agriculture, about building, about organising society. But the language was strange, very clinical. Not the gods blessed humanity with knowledge, but the subjects were educated in necessary procedures. Like a mission report, you understand? Like colonisers documenting their process. Did you take photographs? Of course. Hours of documentation, all confiscated when we were expelled. Mercier paused, looked around his small living room as if checking for listeners, then continued more quietly. But I kept some notes, personal observations that weren't in the official documentation. I can show you those, if you promise to be careful with what you do with them. The notes described in detail what Mercier had seen, observations that hadn't made it into the confiscated official reports. The figures in the carvings wore fitted garments with what looked like functional features, pockets or pouches or equipment attachment points. Their heads were covered with something that looked like protective gear, angular and smooth, with areas that might have been viewing ports or sensors. These weren't gods, Mercier's notes read. These were technicians, specialists, people in equipment designed for a specific environment. Everything about them suggested function over form, purpose over decoration. And the vehicles were even more interesting, with what looked like attitude control thrusters, landing struts, modular components. Whoever carved these images knew what they were looking at because they'd seen it. The Iranian site completed the pattern Monroe and Reeves were building. In 2008, an Iranian team working near Susa, the ancient capital of Elam in southwestern Iran, found clay cylinders sealed in a foundation deposit beneath a temple complex. The cylinders contained cuneiform text that, when translated, described the Anunnaki not as spiritual beings, but as physical entities who came from a place beyond the sky, whose home was a wandering star that brought them close to Earth in cycles measured in thousands of years. The text described their arrival as a necessity, not a choice. Their home world was dying, or moving away, or becoming uninhabitable. Earth was identified as suitable for their purposes, rich in resources they needed, compatible enough with their biology to allow colonization with appropriate precautions, and humanity. Humanity was described as a solution to a labour shortage. The Anunnaki needed workers for their projects, mining operations or construction or agriculture, tasks that required intelligence and dexterity but not full consciousness or equality. So they created humans by modifying existing primates native to Earth, uplifting them through genetic manipulation to serve specific purposes. The Iranian government classified the findings immediately, invoking cultural heritage protection laws that made the cylinders state secrets. No translation was published. No photographs were released. The team members were told their work had national security implications and that discussing it publicly would result in serious consequences. But one team member, a linguist specialising in ancient Elamite and Akkadian, had fled Iran 3 years later during the political turmoil of the Green Movement. Now, living in Germany under a different name, she was willing to talk to Monroe about what she'd translated, though she wouldn't allow her identity to be revealed. The cylinders were very specific about timescales, she explained in careful English. They described the arrival as happening 43 cycles ago, each cycle being the time it took for their homeworld to complete one orbit and return to the inner region where Earth was located. They calculated each cycle as approximately 3,600 Earth years. 43 cycles at 3,600 years each. That's approximately 155,000 years ago. Right around the time modern humans began exhibiting behavioural modernity, when Homo sapiens suddenly started creating art, using symbolic communication, developing complex tools and social structures. The evolutionary leap that anthropologists call the Great Leap Forward, when anatomically modern humans who'd existed for 200,000 years suddenly started acting human, suddenly developed the cognitive capabilities that would lead to civilization. Monroe and Reeves looked at the map they'd been building, marked with excavation sites across ancient Mesopotamia, Syria and Turkey. Every site with a suppressed discovery, every location where unusual findings had been classified or confiscated, fell along a specific geographic arc. The arc matched the old Persian descriptions of a place called Eden, a land of rivers and fertile plains where the gods first created their garden and began their work with humanity. The Hebrews later adopted the story, translating Eden into Eden, the garden at the beginning of the world where God created the first humans. It's not mythology, Reeves said, staring at the map. It's a preserved memory of something that actually happened. The locations are real. The timeline is consistent, multiple independent, cultures separated by thousands of years, all describing the same events in the same region. Monroe nodded slowly. If the Anunnaki were real, if they actually came to Earth and genetically engineered humans, then every site along this arc might contain evidence of their work, and someone has been systematically finding that evidence and classifying it for at least 30 years, probably longer. We need to see one of these sites ourselves, Reeves said. We need first-hand evidence that isn't filtered through confiscated reports and leaked documents. Monroe looked at him carefully. That's dangerous. If someone is actively suppressing this information, if governments and private contractors are coordinating to keep it secret, then investigating too openly makes us targets. I know. Reeves pointed to a location on the map in southern Turkey. But I'm already too deep to stop now. and there's one site we can access without permits or official channels, a place that's already been excavated and studied, where we can look for the same patterns without alerting anyone. Göbekli Tepe, Monroe said. Göbekli Tepe, Reeves confirmed. AC-4, the connection. They flew into Gaziantep, Turkey, in late May of 2024, travelling separately to avoid attention. Monroe used her journalist credentials to arrange interviews with local tourism officials, establishing a cover story about writing an article on archaeological tourism in southeastern Turkey. Reeves came as a tourist, just another visitor interested in ancient history. Göbekli Tepe is extraordinary even by mainstream archaeological standards. It's a massive stone temple complex dating back nearly 12,000 years, built by people who supposedly hadn't invented agriculture yet, hadn't developed writing, hadn't created permanent settlements or centralised authority. Yet somehow, these primitive hunter-gatherers organised the labour and expertise to quarry, carve, transport and erect stone pillars weighing up to 20 tons each, arranged in perfect circles with astronomical alignments and sophisticated artistic imagery. The site rewrites everything archaeologists thought they knew about the development of human civilization. The standard narrative says agriculture comes first, then permanent settlements, then social complexity, then monumental architecture, then religion and art. Göbekli Tepe reverses that sequence completely. It suggests that religion and communal gathering came first, that the desire to build sacred spaces drove human development rather than practical concerns like food production and shelter. It's a reasonable theory, supported by evidence, accepted by mainstream archaeology as a revolutionary but legitimate discovery. But Reeves and Monroe weren't interested in the official narrative. They were looking for something else, for patterns that might connect Göbekli Tepe to the other suppressed sites they'd researched. They spent 3 days at the site, photographing everything, taking measurements, examining the carvings on the massive T-shaped pillars. The artistic imagery was sophisticated, depicting animals with anatomical accuracy that suggested close observation, geometric patterns that implied mathematical understanding, and strange symbols that might have been early writing, or might have been something else entirely. On the 4th day, they met with Aydin Yilmaz, a retired geologist who had done core sampling work at Göbekli Tepe in the early 2000s. He'd agreed to meet them at a small cafe in Şanlıurfa, near a city, after Monroe contacted him through academic channels and mentioned that they were investigating unusual findings at ancient sites. Yilmaz was in his early 70s, lean and weathered, with the careful manner of someone who'd spent decades working with data that didn't fit comfortable explanations. He ordered tea for all of them, then got straight to the point. "You're asking about the metal traces," he said in English with a thick accent. "The anomalies I found in the core samples." "Yes," Monroe said. "We've seen similar patterns at other sites. Iridium traces, unusual isotopic ratios, material that doesn't match natural geological processes." Yilmaz nodded slowly. "I've kept my samples and data. Never published because the patterns didn't make sense, and I didn't want to risk my reputation on speculation without more evidence. But I've wondered for 20 years what those traces meant, where they came from." He had brought a box of materials with him, core samples stored in plastic tubes with handwritten labels, printouts of spectroscopic analysis from various labs, notebooks filled with calculations and observations. He spread it all on the table between them like evidence at a trial. "Every core sample taken from the temple area shows metallic micro-residues," Yilmaz explained. "The concentrations are small, parts per million, but they're consistently present throughout the site. The metallic signature is similar to what you'd find at meteor impact sites, high iridium content mixed with platinum group metals. But," Reeves prompted, "but the isotopic ratios are wrong." Yilmaz pulled out a specific printout, pointed to columns of numbers. "Natural meteors have characteristic isotopic signatures, specific ratios of different elements that match what we find in asteroid belt samples and other space debris. These samples don't match. The ratios are off by enough that it can't be explained by natural variation or contamination. Meaning? Monroe asked, though she already suspected the answer. Meaning this is manufactured alloy, not natural meteor material. Someone processed these metals deliberately, mixed them in specific proportions, created a material with properties that serve some purpose, and then someone used that material at this site 12,000 years ago. The implications hung in the air between them. Göbekli Tepe was already difficult to explain with conventional theories. Hunter-gatherers building massive stone temples was strange enough, but hunter-gatherers using manufactured extraterrestrial alloys? That pushed the boundaries of credible explanation into territory most archaeologists wouldn't touch. How widely distributed are the traces? Reeves asked. Are they concentrated in specific areas, or spread throughout the site? Yilmaz consulted his notebooks. Most concentrated around the central pillars in each circle, particularly at the base where the pillars were set into the bedrock. Also present in the soil layers associated with the construction period, less so in earlier or later layers. So whatever this material was, it was being used during the building phase, Monroe said. Maybe as some kind of tool or equipment that left residue. Or maybe, Reeves said quietly, it was incorporated intentionally, some kind of marker or signature, something that would identify this location as important to whoever put it there. Yilmaz looked between them carefully. You're suggesting something beyond conventional archaeology. We're following evidence, Monroe said. Sometimes evidence leads to uncomfortable places. They spent another 2 hours going through Yilmaz's data, documenting everything with photographs and detailed notes. The metallic traces were undeniably present. The isotopic analysis was rigorous and properly conducted, and the conclusion that the material was manufactured rather than natural was solidly supported by the data. As they were preparing to leave, Yilmaz added one more observation. There's something else I never understood. The astronomical alignments at Göbekli Tepe are very precise, tracking the positions of specific stars as they would have appeared 12,000 years ago. But there's one alignment that doesn't match any known celestial object, pointing to a region of space where nothing significant is visible. Where? Reeves asked. Yilmaz pulled out a star chart marked with calculations. The ecliptic south pole below the plane of the solar system. The pillars aligned to point towards something that would have been in that direction 12,000 years ago. Something important enough to memorialize in stone, but nothing we can identify today. Monroe and Reeves exchanged glances. The ecliptic south pole. The direction from which something might approach if it was coming from outside the solar system, or from a highly inclined orbit that took it far above or below the plane where the planets travel. That means someone brought it here, Monroe said after they'd left the cafe and were walking through Şanlıurfa's bustling streets. The Anunnaki, or whoever they actually were, they used manufactured materials. They had technology sophisticated enough to leave traces that last 12,000 years, and they built monuments aligned to point toward where they came from. Reeves was quiet for a moment, thinking through the implications. The tablets weren't offerings to gods. They were logs, records, an archive of what they did here, who they were, where they came from, and someone is finding those records and classifying them because the information is still relevant today. But relevant how? Monroe asked. What could ancient genetic engineering and extraterrestrial visitors have to do with current government and corporate interests? They didn't have an answer yet, but they were about to find one. Ast 5, Genesis 2. Back in London. In early June, Monroe continued working her intelligence sources, looking for any connection between the suppressed archaeological discoveries and current scientific research. She was looking for organisations that might have an interest in ancient genetic information, in extraterrestrial materials, in anything that connected past and present in the way she was beginning to suspect. It took 6 weeks of careful investigation, following money trails through corporate filings and grant applications, tracing personnel movements between government agencies and private research facilities, before she found the connection. Genesis 2. a classified research project launched in 2018 by a consortium that included biotech companies in the United States, United Kingdom, Germany and Japan, coordinated through government research agencies and funded by a mixture of public and private money hidden behind multiple layers of corporate structure. The project had a public face, occasionally mentioned in scientific journals and research publications. Officially, it was advanced genome editing research, building on CRISPR technology to develop treatments for genetic diseases. The papers describe sophisticated techniques for precisely modifying human DNA, correcting mutations that cause conditions like sickle cell anemia and cystic fibrosis, potentially addressing thousands of genetic disorders. Legitimate medical research, the kind that gets funding from major institutions and regulatory approval from ethics boards. The kind of work that wins Nobel Prizes and changes the future of medicine. But Monroe obtained leaked internal communications through a source she would never name, a whistleblower who'd been disturbed by what they'd seen inside the project and felt the public needed to know. The documents painted a very different picture of what Genesis 2 was actually doing. The project wasn't just fixing genetic defects, it was reverse engineering something ancient, using information extracted from Sumerian texts that had been translated by specialists working for ArcGeo Solutions. One internal memo, dated March of 2022, laid it out clearly. Primary objective is not disease treatment, but enhancement architecture. Using template sequences derived from recovered ancient genetic codices, cross-referenced with modern human genome mapping, we're identifying optimizations present in the original design that have degraded through evolutionary drift. Current protocols focus on neural efficiency, cellular regeneration capability, and lifespan extension through telomere integrity restoration. Another document described the source material. Cuneiform texts provided by Archon Bio Division contain remarkably detailed genetic instruction protocols, describable in modern terms as gene insertion sequences with specific ratio requirements. Text designates these as patterns set in clay, with binding pairs that encode various physiological traits. Direct correlation to chromosomal pair structure suggests source material authors possess sophisticated understanding of genetics. They weren't following mythology, they were following a recipe, instructions left behind by whoever created humans in the first place, now being decoded by scientists with the technology to understand what they were looking at. One file labelled Enki Protocol Primary Implementation outlined specific gene sequences being tested. The sequences were based on ratios described in ancient texts. 7 parts existing human genome to 3 parts modified sequence, introducing changes that enhance cognitive function, improved cellular repair mechanisms, extended natural lifespan, increased disease resistance. The scientific language was dense, full of technical terminology about protein synthesis and gene expression, and cellular signaling pathways. But the core concept was clear. Someone was attempting to recreate the Anunnaki's original work, to engineer humans according to an ancient template that had been preserved in cuneiform text for 45 centuries. One document contained a section that made Monroe's hands shake as she read it. Phase 1 trials completed successfully on 23 subjects. All binding pair modifications achieved stable integration. Subjects demonstrate enhanced cognitive processing, improved pattern recognition, extended concentration capability, physical health markers within acceptable ranges, no significant adverse effects observed. Proceeding to Phase 2 expansion to larger subject pool. 23 subjects, the same number of binding pairs mentioned in the ancient texts, the same number of chromosome pairs in the human genome, not coincidence, a deliberate correspondence, following the original design specifications. Another memo discussed the broader implications. If template sequences prove universally applicable across human populations, potential applications extend beyond medical treatment into augmentation territory. Military applications obvious, enhanced soldiers with superior cognitive and physical capabilities, economic applications significant, optimized workforce with reduced health costs and extended productive lifespan. Social engineering potential requires careful ethical consideration, but represents revolutionary capability for shaping human future. They weren't curing diseases, they were redesigning humanity according to ancient specifications left by whoever created us in the first place. And they were doing it under the cover of medical research, hidden behind classifications and corporate privacy, without public knowledge or democratic oversight. Monroe showed the documents to Reeves in late July. They met at a small flat she'd rented in East London under a false name, both of them increasingly paranoid about surveillance, after weeks of investigating organisations with significant resources and motivation to keep secrets. Reeves read through everything twice, his face growing paler as the implications sank in. They're not just studying ancient history, they're using it. They found instruction manuals for creating humans and they're following them. The Anunnaki weren't gods, Monroe said. They were genetic engineers. They came to Earth with specific purposes, modified existing primates to create a workforce suited to their needs, documented everything in records that survived as mythology. And now we've reached the point where we can understand those records and recreate their work. But why? Reeves asked. What's the purpose? If someone has the resources to do this, why hide it? Why not announce a breakthrough in genetic medicine and accept the accolades? Because it's not medicine, Monroe said. Or not just medicine. Look at the applications they're discussing. Military enhancement, workforce optimization, social engineering. They're talking about creating a new type of human, designed for specific purposes, just like the Anunnaki created us. Which makes us the gods this time, Reeves said slowly. We're doing to ourselves what was done to us, following the same pattern, repeating the cycle. Monroe pulled up one more document, the one that had disturbed her most. A progress report from April of 2024, just weeks after Reeves's dig at Eridu had been shut down. Eridu recovery operation successful. Additional genetic codices retrieved from sealed chamber, expanding template library significantly. New sequences under analysis, with particular focus on behavioural modification protocols and reproductive compatibility specifications. Integration into Phase 3 planning underway. They'd gone back to Eridu after shutting down Reeves's excavation. They'd taken everything from the sealed chamber, all the information carved into those walls, and they were using it to advance their human redesign project. We have to expose this, Reeves said. We have to get this information public before they go too far. Monroe looked at him carefully. If we do that, we become major problems for very powerful people. Organisations with government connections and corporate resources and no interest in having their work disrupted. I know, Reeves met her eyes. But if we don't, they keep going. They keep following ancient instructions to redesign humanity without consent, without oversight, without any consideration of what it means to fundamentally alter what humans are. Monroe nodded slowly. Then we need more evidence. Something irrefutable. Something that proves not just what they're doing, but what it's based on. We need to confirm that the Anunnaki were real, that their legacy is still active, that this isn't just mythology being misinterpreted by zealous scientists. The vault, Reeves said. The sealed chamber under Eridu. If we can get back there, if we can document what's actually in that chamber before Archon processes everything, we'll have evidence that connects past to present. That's incredibly dangerous. I know, but I have a contact in Iraq, someone from the original dig who might be able to help us get access. Monroe looked at the documents spread across the table, the evidence of a project that was redesigning human nature based on ancient genetic engineering specifications. When do we leave? Soon, Reeves said. Before they finish Phase 3 and whatever they're planning next. They started planning their return to Iraq. They arranged for encrypted backups of all their evidence, distributed to multiple trusted sources, with instructions to release everything if they didn't check in regularly. They prepared cover stories and travel arrangements, keeping everything compartmentalised and careful. By early September, they were ready to go. That was when everything accelerated in ways they couldn't have anticipated. Ast 6. The earthquake. On April 10th, 2024, just 6 days after Reeves's excavation was shut down, a minor earthquake struck near Basra in southern Iraq. Magnitude 4.2 on the Richter scale, centred about 15 kilometres west of the city. It was barely noticed internationally, just another small seismic event in a geologically active region. Local news reported minor damage to buildings, some cracked roads, no casualties. Standard earthquake, nothing unusual. Iraq sits near the collision zone between the Arabian and Eurasian tectonic plates, so small quakes happen regularly. This one was slightly larger than average, but nothing catastrophic. Except something else happened during that earthquake, something that wasn't widely reported at the time but would become significant later. A subterranean facility was partially exposed about 8 kilometres from the earthquake's epicentre. Construction workers building a new industrial complex had been excavating for foundation work when the ground collapsed, revealing tunnels and chambers that had been hidden under centuries of sediment. Local engineers were called in to assess the structural damage and make sure nothing would collapse further. The industrial site was near oil infrastructure, so any ground instability was a serious concern. The engineers rappelled down into the newly opened void to map its extent and determine whether the surrounding area was safe. What they found didn't match their expectations at all. The tunnels were old, clearly ancient, carved into bedrock with precision that seemed impossible for primitive technology. But they weren't rough or irregular like natural caves. They were engineered, with smooth walls that showed tooling marks, regular dimensions that suggested deliberate design, and a layout that implied purpose rather than random formation. The engineers followed the main tunnel for about 30 metres before it opened into a larger chamber. That's where they found something that made them stop their survey and immediately contact Baghdad. In the centre of the chamber sat a sphere roughly 3 metres in diameter, partially unearthed by the earthquake's disruption of the surrounding soil. It was made of a dark stone-like material, smooth and slightly reflective, covered in inscriptions similar to ancient cuneiform but more complex, more dense with information, carved in layers that suggested multiple rounds of inscription over time. And it was active. The engineers' radio equipment started malfunctioning as soon as they entered the chamber, producing static and interference that made communication difficult. Their measuring instruments showed erratic readings, electromagnetic fields that shouldn't exist around inert stone. One engineer had brought a handheld thermal camera, and when he pointed it at the sphere, it registered a clear thermal signature, heat generation that had no apparent source. They retreated quickly and made their report. The Iraqi government responded within hours, sending specialists from multiple agencies, cordoning off the area and issuing immediate classification orders that made the discovery state secret. But some of the engineers had made recordings on their personal phones. Some of them had downloaded the instrument data before it was confiscated, and some of them were disturbed enough by what they'd found that they leaked information to friends and family, who shared it on social media, who sent it to researchers and journalists who might know what it meant. Monroe had sources monitoring Middle Eastern social media and obscure forums where leakers sometimes posted information. In late April, one of those sources flagged a series of posts from Iraqi accounts describing the discovery, including grainy cell phone videos that showed the sphere in its chamber. The government's official statement came quickly: natural mineral formations exposed by the earthquake, unusual geological phenomena caused by groundwater interactions, nothing of concern, the site sealed for safety reasons. Standard bureaucratic language designed to dismiss curiosity and discourage investigation. But the cell phone footage showed something else. The sphere's surface was clearly covered in intentional inscriptions, not natural formations. The electromagnetic readings were documented in photos of instrument displays, and one video, shot from just a few metres away before the engineers retreated, showed something. extraordinary. The inscriptions on the sphere were glowing very faintly, a barely visible blue luminescence that pulsed in slow rhythm. The pulse was regular, occurring approximately every 2 seconds, constant and precise like a heartbeat. Monroe obtained more data through her sources, including copies of the official technical survey that had been classified but leaked by someone inside the Iraqi government. The survey was thorough and professional, conducted by competent engineers who knew their work. The electromagnetic readings were consistent and measurable, showing field strengths that varied from approximately 0.3 to 0.8 milligauss, pulsing in the same 2-second cycle visible in the glowing inscriptions. The thermal signature measured roughly 3 degrees Celsius above ambient temperature, again pulsing with the same rhythm. Most importantly, the spectroscopic analysis of the sphere's material showed it wasn't any kind of natural stone. It was a composite, layers of different materials fused together with precision that required sophisticated manufacturing. The outer layer contained high concentrations of iridium and platinum group metals in manufactured alloy ratios identical to what Yilmaz had found at Göbekli Tepe. Someone had built this thing using extraterrestrial materials, buried it kilometers underground in southern Iraq, and left it in a state where it could remain functional for thousands of years. If they built man in their image, Monroe's voice recorded in a memo she prepared in May, what if they left themselves a way to come back? What if this isn't a monument or a record? What if it's a beacon still transmitting after all this time, sending a signal to whoever put it here that Earth is still here, still occupied, still relevant? She and Reeves had added the Basra discovery to their growing database of suppressed evidence, another piece of the pattern they were constructing. The timing was suspicious, occurring just days after the Eridu excavation was shut down, in the same region, exposing technology that matched the evidence Reeves had found. And the fact that it was still active, still generating electromagnetic fields and thermal signatures after thousands of years, suggested engineering far beyond anything ancient humans should have been capable of creating. By the time Monroe and Reeves were planning their return to Iraq in early September, they'd accumulated evidence of multiple sites along the arc of ancient Mesopotamia where advanced technology had been found and classified, where genetic information had been preserved in texts that modern scientists were now decoding and using. They'd connected past to present, shown that the Anunnaki weren't mythology but preserved memory of something real, demonstrated that modern organizations with significant resources were following ancient instructions to redesign human genetics. But they still needed something that would convince skeptics, something that would break through the natural resistance to believing something so extraordinary. They needed direct evidence from the source, from the sealed chamber under Eridu where it all began. That's where they went in mid-September of 2024, using contacts and careful planning to slip past the security that Archon had established around the site, and that's where they vanished. Act 7. The Global Link. While Monroe and Reeves were investigating suppressed archaeological sites and classified genetic research, other patterns were emerging on a global scale that seemed unrelated at first, but fit disturbingly well into the larger picture they had been assembling. In July of 2024, NASA quietly censored portions of deep space infrared data collected by the James Webb Space Telescope. The data had been made available to researchers through standard channels, then was suddenly reissued with sections marked as corrupted or containing instrumentation errors that rendered them unreliable. This wasn't entirely unusual. Space telescope data sometimes contains artifacts from cosmic ray impacts or sensor glitches, and corrections are routine. But the scope of the censoring was significant, affecting multiple observation periods focused on the outer solar system, particularly data collected while the telescope was imaging regions near Jupiter and beyond. Several astronomers who had already downloaded the original uncorrected data noticed something interesting in the sections that were later marked as corrupted. The infrared reading showed gravitational anomalies, subtle perturbations in the orbital paths of trans-Neptunian objects that suggested gravitational influence from something massive in the outer solar system. Not Neptune, not Pluto, not any of the known dwarf planets or large Kuiper Belt objects. Something else, something big enough to affect multiple orbits in measurable ways. The astronomers started comparing notes and private communications, trying to determine whether the anomalies were real or actually instrumental errors. The data was ambiguous enough that reasonable people could disagree, but there was enough signal there to be intriguing. One researcher, an astrophysicist at MIT named Jennifer Kowalski, ran simulations based on the anomaly data to estimate what kind of object could produce the observed effects. Her preliminary results suggested a large planet-sized body, possibly several times Earth's mass, in a highly elliptical orbit that took it far beyond Pluto for most of its cycle, but brought it into the inner solar system periodically. The orbital parameters she calculated matched, with uncomfortable precision, predictions that had been made decades earlier by Zecharia Sitchin, a controversial author who had written extensively about ancient Sumerian texts and their descriptions of the Anunnaki. Sitchin's work had been largely dismissed by mainstream academics as pseudoscience, misinterpretations of ancient texts combined with faulty astronomy and wishful thinking. He claimed that Sumerian texts described a planet called Nibiru, massive and distant, whose highly elliptical orbit brought it close to Earth approximately every 3,600 years. When Nibiru approached, according to Sitchin's interpretation of the texts, the Anunnaki would return to Earth, checking on their creation, harvesting resources, maintaining their ancient installations. The texts supposedly described multiple return visits throughout history, corresponding to major transitions in human civilization, like the rise of Sumerian culture and the Bronze Age collapse. Mainstream science had rejected all of this. The astronomical predictions didn't match any observed objects, the textual interpretations were considered overly literal and selective, and the whole narrative was dismissed as ancient astronaut pseudoscience that distorted real archaeology and history. But now, Kowalski's analysis based on actual observational data was producing orbital parameters that closely matched Sitchin's predictions, at least in broad strokes. The match wasn't perfect, but it was close enough to be disturbing. She posted her preliminary findings on a preprint server used by astronomers to share work before formal peer review. Within days, her paper was flagged and removed, marked as violating terms of service for promoting fringe theories without adequate scientific basis. Her NASA data access was suspended pending review of her research protocols, but several dozen researchers had already downloaded her paper and the supporting data. Some of them started their own analyses, tried to replicate her findings, looked for other evidence of gravitational anomalies in the outer solar system. The conversation spread through astronomical circles and spilled over into internet forums where amateur researchers and conspiracy theorists tracked evidence of official suppression and hidden knowledge. People started mapping Sitchin's predicted orbit against current planetary positions, calculating when a hypothetical Nibiru might be making its closest approach if it actually existed. The estimates varied depending on assumptions about orbital parameters, but most converged on a time frame in the mid to late 2020s, meaning now, or very soon. Meaning that if something was indeed approaching from the outer solar system, it might already be close enough to detect if anyone with access to good telescopes was looking in the right direction. Monroe had been tracking these developments through her network of sources, adding them to the overall picture she and Reeves were building. The astronomical data by itself wasn't conclusive, could easily be explained away as instrumental errors or misinterpretation of ambiguous measurements. But combined with everything else, with suppressed archaeological evidence and classified genetic research and ancient texts describing cyclic returns of the Anunnaki, it formed a pattern that was harder to dismiss. If Nibiru was real, if something massive was indeed approaching from the outer solar system, then what Monroe had asked in one of her notes became urgently relevant. What if the Anunnaki are already preparing Earth to receive them? She'd obtained one more document that tied everything together in ways that chilled her to read. A leaked memo from Archon Geo Solutions dated August of 2024, marked with classification levels that suggested it had been distributed only to senior personnel with specific clearances. The memo was brief, bureaucratic in tone, discussing project status in neutral technical language. Phase 3 genomic synchronization complete. Population markers within acceptable variance across target demographics. Template stability confirmed through 6-month monitoring of Phase 2 cohort. Neural enhancement protocols demonstrate sustained efficacy with no degradation. Cellular regeneration improvements holding stable. Awaiting return signal for Phase 4 implementation. Return signal. As if someone was expected to send a message. As if someone was coming back and would need certain preparations to have been completed before their arrival. Phase 4 was mentioned but not detailed in the memo Monroe had obtained, marked as classified above the document's security level. But the implication was clear. Genesis 2 had multiple phases planned, with each phase building toward some ultimate objective that required human populations to meet specific genetic criteria before implementation. If the Anunnaki were real, if they'd created humanity for specific purposes through genetic engineering, and if they were returning, then Phase 4 might be about ensuring their creations were ready, compatible, suitable for whatever purposes the Anunnaki had in mind, creating an interface, preparing a workforce, establishing compatibility between ancient genetic engineers and their modern redesigned product. Monroe had shared all of this with Reeves during their planning sessions before the Iraq trip, laying out the full scope of what they'd uncovered. The evidence was circumstantial, could be dismissed by skeptics as pattern matching and conspiracy thinking, but the pattern was consistent and the connections were documentable. "They're not coming back to check on us," Reeves had said after reading everything. "They're coming back to use us. We're a resource they created, a tool they left behind, and now they're making sure the tool is properly maintained and upgraded before they need it again." Which makes humanity what? Monroe had asked. Property, equipment, a biological technology they designed for specific purposes? Yes, Reeves said simply. Genesis 2 is making sure we're functioning according to specifications, ready for whatever they have planned. That was the reality they were facing as they prepared to return to Erech, to investigate the sealed chamber under Eridu where it all began. They weren't just uncovering ancient history anymore. They were documenting an ongoing operation that spanned thousands of years, from humanity's creation to our present moment, all building towards something that might be imminent if the astronomical data was accurate. Their last communication before entering Iraq was an encrypted video sent to Marcus Webb, the independent researcher Monroe trusted as a dead man's switch. If they didn't return, he was supposed to release everything they'd found, make it public regardless of the consequences. "We've confirmed the existence of a sealed vault under Eridu," Monroe said in the video, her face serious but calm. "The coordinates match the old texts exactly. We're going in tonight with a local contact. The Anunnaki never left. They went underground." Reeves added his own thoughts. "If we're right, everything changes. Human history, human origin, the entire narrative of where we come from and why we're here. This isn't archaeology anymore. This is contact." Then darkness, movement, the video ending. That was September 21st, 2024. Neither Monroe nor Reeves has been heard from since. Act 8. The last transmission. The final piece of evidence, the most controversial and hardest to verify, emerged 6 weeks after Monroe and Reeves vanished. In late October of 2024, a video file appeared on an encrypted server known for hosting leaked classified material, a dark web location that had previously published government documents and corporate secrets. The server was shut down within hours of the video appearing, taken offline through coordinated action by multiple governments, but not before several researchers managed to download the file and distribute copies through other channels. The video is grainy handheld footage, clearly shot on a consumer camera or phone in challenging conditions with minimal lighting. The timestamp in the corner is corrupted, showing random characters instead of actual date and time, but forensic analysis of the visual artifacts and compression patterns suggests it was recorded in late September of 2024, consistent with when Monroe and Reeves disappeared. The video begins with darkness and the sound of heavy breathing, footsteps on stone. Then dim light appears, provided by small LED flashlights that create harsh shadows and limited visibility. The camera pans across walls of carved stone, underground, clearly ancient. But these walls aren't ordinary archaeological remains. They're covered in inscriptions that glow faintly with blue luminescence, not from external illumination, but from within the carvings themselves, as if the stone had been treated with some kind of luminescent material, or as if the inscriptions themselves were generating light through some unknown process. The glow pulses slowly, rhythmically, getting slightly brighter and dimmer in cycles that last about 2 seconds each. The pattern is identical across all the walls, synchronized as if controlled by some central mechanism. Rachel Monroe's voice, recognizable from other recordings, though the audio quality is poor. This isn't a tomb, it's not a temple or a storage vault, it's a system, a machine that's been asleep for thousands of years. The camera continues panning, and the inscriptions pulse brighter as the lens passes over them. The patterns are extraordinarily complex, layered information encoded in visual form, some characters recognizable as variations on Sumerian cuneiform, but others completely unknown, geometric and precise in ways that suggest mathematical or technical notation rather than linguistic meaning. "It's reacting to us," Reeves's voice says from behind the camera, tense with excitement or fear or both. "Our presence, our bioelectric fields, something, it's waking up. We're activating something that hasn't been active in millennia." The camera focuses on the centre of the chamber, showing a raised circular platform about 4 meters in diameter. The platform is made of the same glowing stone as the walls, with inscriptions arranged in concentric circles radiating from a depression in the exact centre. The depression is shaped vaguely like a handprint, but with 7 distinct contact points instead of 5, arranged in a pattern that doesn't match human anatomy. Each contact point is about 3 centimeters deep, smooth-sided, clearly intentional. Monroe moves into frame, approaches the platform carefully, examining the depression without touching it. "This is an interface," she says, "a control mechanism, but designed for something with different hands than humans, different number of digits, different proportions." "Don't touch it," Reeves says from behind the camera. "We don't know what it does, what it might activate." "I'm not going to," Monroe says. But she leans closer, examining the inscriptions around the depression. These symbols, they're instructions, sequential steps for operating something, and they reference the timing, the cycles, the return of... Oh God! Suddenly a low-frequency hum fills the audio, deep enough that it's probably felt more than heard, vibrating through the stone and the air, resonating in frequencies that make the camera shake slightly even though Monroe's hands are steady. The inscriptions on the walls brighten significantly, the blue glow intensifying and spreading through the carved channels like liquid flowing through irrigation canals, filling in patterns that weren't visible before, lighting up in sequence as if energy was moving through specific pathways. The hum increases in pitch and intensity, becoming almost musical, overtones harmonizing in ways that sound deliberately arranged, mathematically precise. The light flows toward the ceiling, concentrating on a central point directly above the platform where the walls curve to meet. The symbols arrange themselves into a configuration, a specific pattern that wasn't visible before when the inscriptions were inactive. The image is familiar, iconic even. The winged disc, the symbol seen on countless Sumerian tablets and Babylonian monuments, the representation of the Anunnaki's divine authority. But here it's not carved or painted. It's formed by light, by active energy, by a system that's functioning after being dormant for an incomprehensible length of time. The wings spread across the ceiling, geometric and regular, the central disc glowing brighter than the surrounding symbols, pulsing faster now, 4 or 5 times per second. "Oh God," Monroe's voice says, backing away from the platform. "We activated it. Marcus, if you're seeing this, we activated the beacon. We found the interface, and just being here, just entering this chamber, was enough to wake it up. They know we're here, they know we've found it. The system is transmitting." The light continues intensifying, the hum growing louder and more complex, layers of frequency stacking on each other in patterns that suggest information encoding, data transmission, a signal being sent through some medium that isn't apparent. The camera jerks as Reeves starts moving, backing toward what must be the entrance to the chamber. "We need to leave. We need to document this and get out before someone notices. If Arkan is monitoring this area, they'll know the beacon activated." But Monroe doesn't move immediately. She's staring at the ceiling, at the glowing winged disc, transfixed by what she's seeing. "It's not a warning," she says quietly, almost to herself. "It's an invitation. The beacon isn't saying stay away, it's saying we're ready. We're ready for you to come back." The video cuts to black abruptly, leaving only audio, sound of rapid breathing, footsteps on stone echoing an enclosed space, the hum still audible, but starting to fade as they move away from the chamber. Monroe's voice one more time, distant and echoing. The inscriptions describe the timing. 43 cycles since the beginning, each cycle 3,600 years. That's roughly 155,000 years since they first came. But the beacon triggers when humans reach sufficient development to find it and activate it. We just told them we're ready for the next phase. Then nothing. Static hiss of dead audio. The file ends. Conclusion. The pattern complete. So what does all of it mean? What are we supposed to do with this information? Let's lay out what we know, what can be documented, what's supported by leaked evidence and suppressed research that can be traced and verified by anyone willing to do the work. Multiple archaeological sites across the Middle East have yielded discoveries suggesting advanced knowledge that predates known human civilization. These discoveries have been systematically classified or suppressed by government agencies and private contractors acting in coordination. The pattern is consistent. Discovery, documentation, shutdown, silence. Eridu, Harran, Tel Brak, Susa, and others all following the same sequence. Ancient texts from Sumerian, Akkadian, and related cultures describe the Anunnaki not as spiritual beings, but as physical entities with technical knowledge, who created humans through processes that read like genetic engineering when translated carefully and literally. The texts specify ratios, binding pairs, sequential procedures that correlate with modern genetic science in ways that shouldn't be possible for ancient writers working with primitive understanding. Modern genetic research programs, classified and operating under cover of medical research, are using information extracted from these ancient texts to modify human genetics according to ancient template specifications. The Genesis 2 project exists, its documentation is real, and its objectives include human enhancement based on ancient genetic codices recovered from archaeological sites. Astronomical observations suggest possible gravitational anomalies in the outer solar system, consistent with a large planetary body in a highly elliptical orbit, though the data is ambiguous enough that reasonable skepticism is warranted. The orbital parameters loosely match ancient predictions about a wandering planet that returns periodically. Underground installations have been discovered in Iraq containing technology that shouldn't exist, devices made from manufactured extraterrestrial alloys that remain functional after thousands of years of burial, transmitting signals or maintaining readiness for purposes unknown. That's the documented reality, the evidence that exists regardless of how we interpret it. The skeptical explanation remains available. Coincidence, misinterpretation, pattern matching by investigators who wanted to find connections and therefore found them, the ancient texts and mythology being overinterpreted. The genetic research is legitimate medical science, with connections to archaeology being exaggerated. The astronomical data is instrumental error. The underground technology is misidentified natural formations or modern installations mistaken for ancient ones. Everything could be explained away if you're committed to conventional narratives and uncomfortable with extraordinary possibilities. But what if it's not? What if every piece of evidence is genuine? What if the Anunnaki were real, physical beings who came to Earth from somewhere else, who understood genetics and engineering in ways that seemed like magic to primitive humans who witnessed their work, who created humanity for specific purposes through deliberate modification of existing species? Then the implications reshape everything we think we know about ourselves. Human history isn't what we've been taught. We're not the product of purely natural evolution, or at least not entirely. We're designed, engineered, created by beings with capabilities far beyond what our ancestors could comprehend. Those beings documented their work in texts that survived as mythology, preserved through countless retellings and translations because the information was too important to lose completely. They left installations, buried technology, monitoring systems that could remain dormant for thousands of years and reactivate when the right conditions were met. The conditions being humans developed enough to find the installations, understand what they were looking at, and trigger the systems that would signal our creators that we'd reached sufficient sophistication. We call them myths because it's easier than calling them memories. Because accepting them as memories means accepting that everything we think we know about human origin and human nature might be incomplete at best, deliberately obscured at worst. It means accepting that we might not be alone in the universe, and that we never have been. That we're part of something larger, an operation that spans thousands of years from humanity's creation to our present moment, all building toward purposes we're only beginning to comprehend. And the scariest part? We might have just activated the signal that tells them to come back. The sealed chamber under Eridu exists. The inscriptions are real, carved by people with knowledge that predates any known civilization. The beacon, if that's what it is, was dormant until human investigators entered that space and triggered systems that had been waiting for exactly that moment. Monroe and Reeves found it. They activated it. They documented what happened and sent one final message before vanishing. Were they captured by Archon personnel monitoring the site? Are they being held somewhere, prevented from revealing what they discovered? Are they dead? Casualties of knowing too much and threatening powerful interests that want this information suppressed? Or are they somewhere else entirely? Somewhere underground in chambers lit by blue circuits carved in ancient stone, waiting with whatever they found there for the signal to be answered, for the creators to return and complete whatever plan has been unfolding since the beginning. The Eridu excavation remains officially sealed, classified under a multinational directive that hasn't been explained or justified to anyone outside the agencies involved. Archon Geo Solutions continues operating in Iraq, their activities hidden behind corporate privacy and government classification, their purpose known only to senior personnel with appropriate clearances. Genesis 2 continues its work, publishing occasional papers about genetic medicine, while pursuing objectives that remain classified, following ancient instructions to redesign humanity according to specifications left by our creators. And something might be approaching from the outer solar system, massive and distant, following an orbit that brings it close to Earth on a schedule measured in thousands of years, close enough to matter, close enough to allow whoever or whatever created us to return and check on their work. Daniel Reeves and Rachel Monroe remain missing. Officially, there's no evidence of foul play, no reason to suspect anything beyond two adults choosing to disappear. Their families still hope they'll come home. Investigators have found nothing. Officially, nothing unusual happened in Iraq in 2024. Officially, the Anunnaki are mythology, ancient stories told by primitive people trying to make sense of a confusing world. Officially, humanity evolved naturally through millions of years of random mutation and natural selection. No intervention required, no outside influence needed to explain our consciousness or capabilities. Officially, we're alone. We've always been alone. And the gods who shaped us from clay are nothing more than stories. But late at night, when you're drifting off to sleep, when the rational mind loosens its grip and older instincts surface, maybe you'll wonder. Maybe you'll think about the winged disc carved on tablets 5,000 years old, glowing in underground chambers that haven't been opened in millennia. Maybe you'll think about the impossible precision of ancient structures, the sophisticated knowledge encoded in cuneiform that nobody should have possessed, the stories every civilization tells about gods who came from the sky and made humans in their image. Maybe you'll look up at the stars and wonder what's out there in the dark, beyond Neptune and Pluto, in the cold reaches where orbits take thousands of years to complete. Maybe you'll wonder if something is coming closer, making its slow, inevitable approach toward the inner solar system, toward the planet where its creation waits. Maybe you'll wonder if we were designed to wonder, if curiosity itself is part of the program, if every question we ask brings us closer to the answers they left for us to find when we were finally sophisticated enough to understand them. And maybe, just maybe, you'll realise that the beacon has already been activated, that the signal has already been sent, that we've announced ourselves to whoever created us, told them we've reached the development level they were waiting for, triggered the systems they left to monitor our progress. The Anunnaki aren't coming back. They're already here. They've always been here, waiting in chambers beneath Eridu and Göbekli Tepe, and a dozen other sites along the arc of ancient Mesopotamia. Sleeping in technology we mistake for ancient stone, encoded in the very DNA that makes us human, preserved in texts we dismissed as mythology for thousands of years, waiting for us to be ready, waiting for us to find them, waiting for us to fulfill whatever purpose they designed us for when they shaped the clay and called it human, and set us on a path that led inevitably to this moment. Phase 4 is coming. The return signal has been sent, and we're about to discover what we were actually created for all those thousands of years ago when beings from somewhere else decided Earth needed a workforce designed to specifications they could control. Sweet dreams.